Here's how to master your Alocasia care. I might be new to YouTube, but I've got years of experience growing Alocasias, and I am so confident about my methods that I'm giving away a free Alocasia Dragon's Breath, and I promise to coach you through it all. If you clicked on this video, then I know that you're either an amateur willing to get your Alocasia game going, or you're a curious pro trying to figure out what could I have to possibly add to what's existing on the internet already about Alocasias. And actually, if you're anywhere in between, get ready to level up your Alocasia game by the end of this video. Like I said, I might be new to YouTube, but I've got years and years, over 5 years of growing alocasias, both rare, common varieties, years upon years of data that I've just compiled for you guys in this one video to save you the time and effort of having to figure it all out. In essence, what I'm trying to convey is that it's from trial and error and from growing these plants myself is how I've been able to level up my own alocasia game and continue to grow and continue to learn about them because I've been data banking or data trending how alocasias behave. The great thing about alocasias is that they tell you exactly what they want. You just have to be prepared to listen. I started growing alocasia in 2020, and recently, within the last 3 months, I moved into my new home. That meant I had to acclimate my entire alocasia collection. I did an alocasia tour on YouTube. I'll link that in the description for you to see the length and breadth of my collection, but I had to pretty much test myself and what I believe in, my methods and stuff to ensure that I didn't lose my collection. A key point to understand with allocations is that they tell you what they want. I'm going to highlight that visually for you all so you'll see exactly what I mean with each topic that I'm going to touch on today. And the most common misconception is that once your alocasia probably goes dormant or is down to one leaf, a number of people in the plant community panic and think it's time to repot your alocasia. And let me tell you, the last thing you want to do, or the number one thing I stay away from with alocasias, is repotting them unnecessarily. Okay, so let me tell you everything. The first thing we're going to start with is conditions and care, specifically lighting. What's on the internet is variable, and let me tell you, it is so erroneous. If you have grown alocasias, you'll know exactly what I mean. For example, I got into dual alocasias in a really big way, and they were marketed as being understory plants that require low light. You guessed it, they all declined until I understood that alocasias are visually communicative, and I'm going to show you all what I mean in the next frame. And this visual cue is across the board for every single type of alocasia and applies to anywhere you live in the world. So if you live in the tropics like me, or if you live in temperate regions, it doesn't matter. Just look for this and you'll know. Wherever you place your alocasias, observe the movement of the petioles themselves. Forget the leaves for now. Look at the petioles. Now, remember, I've only moved into the space 3 months now, so I've been testing the space to figure out where's the best fit for my alocasias. So, mine have actually made a complete or almost 90-degree stretch, which means these are not getting sufficient light. However, the ones that are tucked a little more in, those are growing more compact, and the angle in which they are stretching is not like a 90-degree, which is a clear stretch. Look at this leaf, 90 degrees. And it blows my mind to think that some direct light actually touches my Alocasia fridex, specifically my Alocasia fridex, are not getting enough light. They are bending 90 degrees, and that's the number one indicator to move your plants closer to the light source. You don't need a light meter to test this, just look at the petioles. The answers are in the petioles. They will tell you if your plant is not receiving enough light and simply move it closer to the light source. This is also free. It costs you nothing to test your space before committing your alocasia to it. Committing, for example, if you're an outdoor gardener and want to place your alocasias outdoor, place it in a nursery pot first. Test the space and then put it in the ground when you know it's getting enough light. An intelligent guess for beginners is to place your alocasia where your philodendrons are thriving. So if you collect philodendrons as well, just think philodendron light to start with. And just like that, you got two alocasia hacks. The first one being check your petioles. The second one being think philodendron light. Mine, by the way, receive direct early morning sun between the hours of 7 and 9:30 to 10 a.m., as well as late evening light between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. You might want to argue that these are just floppy petioles. I kid you not, they are not. Those petioles are turgid, meaning they are quite firm. The movement is intentional, so you will know based on how turgid or how firm that petiole is moving when you touch it. So it's different to a drooping petiole, which is a little less firm and not as intentional. It also dips down as opposed to forward or in the direction of the light source. So it's not dehydrated here or needs a feed. The variegated varieties are going to need even more light, so I definitely recommend again placing them where your variegated philodendrons are thriving. If you don't collect philodendrons, just use the petiole test. And for variegates, you're going to notice that the variegation starts to decrease if it's not getting enough light or it completely reverts. And here's the proof. This is my Alocasia Frideck that is slowly reverting in the location that I have it in. Remember, I moved into the space only 3 months and I'm now trying to figure it out. The petiole is also at 90 degrees. However, my variegated black velvet loves this spot. The variegation is pronounced and it's actually working on a new leaf. Once you start paying attention, you're going to see the pattern. You might want to argue that it could be a supplement deficiency, but I'm letting you know that I tested this out thoroughly using TPS, silica gold, and Alocasias hate it. So for you pros out there, do not use silica on it. Alocasias hate it. My alocasias are also regularly fertilized, so it's not a supplement deficiency or a feed problem. But don't worry, we'll get into feeds and supplements coming up later on in the video. And here's the first pro tip for you experts out there. Do not use TPS1 silica gold fertilizer on your alocasias with the intention of bringing back variegation. It does not do that. All it causes is haloing. Side note, it does the same thing for anthuriums. Okay, let's move on to humidity as we're still on the topic of conditions and care. So, my personal take is that alocasias are fine in 40 to 60% humidity. From my experience, humidity plays the biggest role for rehabilitation and propagation. In both cases, I recommend a humidity of 80 to 100%. A step-by-step guide to growing allocations from corm is also coming up later on in the video. But what I want to show you is once that first leaf pops out after rehab or propagation, it's fine to place your alocasia in ambient. This little Alocasia cuprea rehab came out after the first leaf popped out, and look, a second one is on the way and it's in ambient now, receiving 40 to 60%. In keeping with alocasias being visually communicative, if your humidity is too high, it's possible to get fungal infections. This is an example of what your leaves might turn into. I know for you beginners, diagnosing brown spots can be quite tricky and difficult. I remember my days of trying to figure it out. It still is difficult for me, especially as alocasias are quite communicative and they are quick to brown and yellow when things go wrong. So I suggest getting a hygrometer from the start. You can use this for all your plants. Another indicator if your humidity in general is too high is the presence of green powdery mildew. Believe me when I say this does not negatively impact your plants in any way, but it can harm you. I've seen many people claiming that this causes root rot and corm rot. It doesn't. And there goes your first allocation myth. Don't forget, later on in the video, I've got a ton of myths that I've debunked, as well as some special considerations to make things even easier for you. Let's move right along to watering. And I'm not gonna lie, this has taken me, or is probably still taking me, honestly, the longest to master. And what I'd say is you really have to take a look at yourself and your watering manner. At the end of this watering section, though, I'll give you my top hack for solving this problem completely. Well, what solved it for me anyway? I know it's going to be subjective based on individual preferences, but my top hack for solving this problem is coming at the end of this watering section. Because alocasias visually communicate with us, if you're an underwaterer, your leaves are going to completely droop and try to touch the floor instead of the light. If it's severely underwatered, your roots are going to deflate, and the response your alocasia is going to give you is the same as that for an overwaterer. And that's all your leaves are going to yellow and possibly drop off, and you're going to experience stem rot, leaf rot, crown rot. Everything is just going to get mushy. Here's where you take control. Within 3 to 5 days, your alocasia is going to respond after watering. I personally feed and supplement hydroponically just to standardize my Alocasia Care a little more. And here comes the watering hack. I actually have two. If you want to bypass this learning curve completely, just switch to using semi-hydro. I have another section dedicated to using semi-hydro that's coming up later on in the video that'll make your life so easy when it comes to watering. The second hack is to top your substrate with moss, whatever it is, whether it's semi-hydro or soil, and use the moss as the indicator for when your alocasia is going to need watering. Your moss is going to dry out first, and that's going to be your visual cue instead of waiting for your alocasia to tell you that it needs watering. For my alocasias growing in soil, I use the moss, yes, as a visual cue that it's coming up to watering time for my alocasia, but I also test the weight of the pot. It's worth your while for understanding the weight of your pot when your plant is well hydrated as opposed to when it's dry. Using a moisture meter can definitely help you understand this concept better, but I do not recommend long term use of the tool because anything that can disturb your alocasia roots over and over is definitely a no no because these are quite fickle when it comes to disturbing their roots. So use it for experimentation, take your notes, and put it away. And here comes another myth that your alocasias should not dry out. But really, how do we quantify that? The moisture meter is your answer again. Having taken that advice, which is that alocasias should never dry out in the early days of growing alocasias, I think what people really mean is alocasias should not dry out till their roots deflate, and that applies to all plants across the board. In keeping with alocasias requiring a moist substrate, what that means is your substrate should never be wet or dry. It needs to be consistently or evenly moist, which means that after watering, your alocasia should be allowed to dry out to a certain extent, especially when growing in soil. Now, soil I am not 100% confident growing in. It is so much easier, and my preference is to grow in semi-hydro. Specifically, my preference is leca because it's cheaper and way more readily available. But when we get into growing in semi-hydro, I will show you just how all of this watering issues, it just disappears or becomes so much easier to deal with. I'm going to show you how to use Lachuzapon and leca next for best results. Before we get to semi-hydro, I want to show you how I water this one alocasia, my Alocasia maharani that lives in soil. The indicators to me that it needed watering was the dry moss on the top and the weight of the pot. It was quite light. Because I've been observing this plant over time, I know it does not like to be saturated or it does not like water to be poured through the entire substrate where water is flowing out the bottom. I used the moss to know that I've poured over the entire surface, and that was the extent of it. Take a look at these roots. You'll notice that there's a main root in the center and then there's secondary roots that grow off of that main root. All alocasias have roots like this. They're not like philodendrons where some have very thick roots and others have very fine roots. Your main goal when growing alocasias is to maintain the secondary roots. Believe it or not, they are more important than the primary roots. They create a wide surface area for the absorption of nutrients and water, and this is what keeps your alocasias happy. Here's a better look at the root network you want to create when you're caring for these plants. Those fine roots are what you want to maintain for as long as possible. These roots will eventually naturally start to die off, but at the same time, they're being replaced by new ones. To make your life easy, just give semi-hydro a try. Whether it's Lachuzapon or leca, I'll show you how to use both. The primary reason why people fail using semi-hydro is because the corm or the tuber that's supporting the alocasia is sitting in water, and that's what you want to avoid with semi-hydro. Using a no drainage vessel and a leca reservoir at the bottom solves all these problems. This is because you can see the water line, and that's the difference between semi-hydro and soil. You can't visually see how much water is in the soil, but when you use semi-hydro, you can see how much water is present. Let me give you a better visual using some of my alocasias that have matured into the system. To the very bottom of the vessel, I place leca. This allows me to create a water line. I'm going to water this one on camera for y'all to see how much water I place in the reservoir, and it's usually 1 inch to 1.5 inches up. If you prefer to use leca alone like I do because it's way cheaper than Lachuzapon, just fill your water reservoir to the same 1 or 1.5 inches up, and that's sufficient for your alocasia. Some alocasias do prefer Lachuzapon over leca though, and I will explain that in the special consideration section. But if you are using Lachuzapon, again, just maintain a layer of leca at the bottom to create that reservoir and you're good to go. I know the visibility is a bit skewed for you to see exactly where the water line is, but what's more important at this point is for you to understand how dense the root network is, having been grown in semi-hydro. I know this is possible in soil also, but I just find it so difficult in soil. For the highest success rate using Lachusapon or Leca, pay attention to this. Up on the screen currently is a comb. This is pretty much a baby alocasia, and here is an alocasia being grown from a tuber. In both cases, neither should be sitting in water, so your water line should be just below both of these. Here's a better look. This is a sprouted comb. At the bottom, that brown bulb, I'm going to sit on top of leca and I'm placing it to one side so you'll have a visual of the comb itself. Once I've set the plant in the vessel, I cover the top with leca as you'll see coming up shortly. And what I do is I make sure and I look for that visual of where the root line starts. That's a clear indicator of where I can expect the comb to be. And once I understand that, I water it so that the water line sits below the root zone and below the comb. Both Lachusapon and Leca operate the same way in that they absorb water. So once there's a water reservoir on the bottom, the substrate remains moist. And that is what alocasias love, a moist substrate. Not a wet or dry one, but moist. Let's just take one step back. Trust me, it's going to be worth your while. You're going to level up your alocasia game and your problems are going to significantly decrease with this genus. I'm rinsing my leca here and you'll see me do the same for the pond because I want to make sure that I have a clear visual from the start of when I'm potting up my alocasia in semi-hydro. By the way, I reuse my leca and pond over and over. Comment below if you'd want to see a video on how I sterilize these substrates, and I've been doing this for years. As you see here, I'm just rinsing my Lachusapon as I did with the leca to ensure that I have the least amount of residue in my reservoir. Rinsing the semi-hydro is just a preference of mine. I've seen people skip this step and their plants do fine. This is just a preference of mine. All in all, it's my preference because I always want to keep a close eye on the roots, especially at the base of my vessel, as I also prefer to grow in no drainage. I'm going to show you how I pot up these sprouted combs using both leca and Lachusapon. I'm just taking a visual here to understand the size of the leaves so that I can gauge the vessel that I'm going to use better. I'm zooming in here for you all to see that there's a ton of green powdery mildew and it didn't affect the combs from sprouting. But anyway, these are the vessels I'm going to use. I'm using one glass vase, another deli cup. I try to recycle as much as I can, and finally a Starbucks cup for the smallest one. And here comes that watering hack that I promised you, using my pre-washed substrates. When I'm planting in Lachusapon, I actually create a leca reservoir at the bottom of the vessel. This is usually about 1 inch to 2 inches high. So in essence, I don't plant using Lachusapon alone. I create a hybrid sort of situation where leca is at the bottom so that I have a clear visual of the waterline. And that is the hack I want to ensure that you all understand. Being able to see your waterline is the greatest thing when growing alocasias as opposed to in soil where I have no clue where the water level is. After I've created that leca layer, then I place a very small amount of the Lachusapon just to coat the top of the leca. By the way, this was the greatest tip I ever got for growing alocasias, and I got it from Charmaine from Unplant Parenthood. I'll put a link to her video for more information for y'all to check out growing in no drainage. Here's something that blew my mind while learning how to care for alocasias, and that is when you're growing in semi-hydro, for some reason, like your roots are absolutely fine sitting in water. This contradicts so much on the internet in terms of roots not sitting in water and it being the main reason for causing root rot. But the sense that I've made of it is these roots are actually water roots. So they're accustomed growing in water, and semi hydro is a hybrid situation of water and a substrate. So I'm guessing these roots have just adjusted to living in water. And this is just the greatest thing about semi-hydro. You just don't have to worry about if there's too much water. And to me, well, my issue was that I'm pretty much an overwaterer. So me not having to think about watering in such a big way was the greatest help ever. But anyway, when planting your alocasias, you want to fan out your roots or spread them apart as best as you can and ensure that the comb or the tuber is sitting at the top of your Lachusapon or leca. You'll see me pot up in leca alone just now, but this is basically defining your root line or the corm line, more importantly, because you never want the corm itself to be sitting in water. That's where all the rotting issues start. The same applies to a tuber as well as the bottom of your stem. So if you have a mature alocasia and you're repotting it, the base of your stem should not be sitting in water. Okay, so I'm going to pot up using leca alone. I'm going to put the smallest alocasia in this using my Starbucks cup, and I'm just going to fill the leca to halfway, and I'm going to pluck this little alocasia out of its nursery pot. Side note, the main issue of green powdery mildew is that it's a hazard for you. So I usually wear a mask when I'm potting up or using this. But to avoid all of that, you can just keep your setup a lot cleaner than mine is. But like I said in previous videos, my plant shows have been really lacking since the move, but I promise you I'm going to get on top of it. But this is the little plant all plucked out. I'm just going to set the comb atop the leca and spread the roots apart as best as I could, and I like to lean the leaf off the edge of the cup for a little more support. And the final step is just to backfill in leca, and this one will be all done. You'll notice that all of them I have not pot up till the brim of the vessel, and that's because alocasias grow very similar to anthurium. If you collect anthurium, you'll understand this next point. They continuously root from their stem as they grow upward, and just burying them a little deeper gives me a lot more time before repotting. So I just backfill over time instead of repotting over and over. Again, this is all in keeping with trying to disturb the roots as least as possible. And for the last one, because I'm so confident growing them in semi-hydro now, I'm just going to pot this up in whatever substrate is left. I know the rule of thumb is to look for that root zone or that root line and ensure that my water line is just below that. Here's a pro tip coming up if you want to grow alocasias from corm. Once my corms have sprouted and I've seen the beginning of roots, I start feeding them using Super Thrive. This ensures great health from the start. So because I know I've fed them well already, I'm going to actually give them their first watering using Great White. For all the plants in my collection, this is how I repot or pot up. I always feed once I see new roots, especially with props using Super Thrive, and then once I pot them up into the preferred substrate, the first watering is with Great White. I'll put a link in the description for all the benefits of Great White, and this applies to all my plants in my collection. I've spent the most time on this portion of the video because for me, the most difficult thing to understand with growing alocasias is how much water they need and to quantify that. I'm hoping that, I'm making things a little clearer for y'all, but believe me, using the semi-hydro has really changed my alocasia game. All I need to understand is where that corm line or tuber line is, and I just water below that, and I keep a constant eye on that level. I mentioned topping with moss as a hack, and I want to explain a little further. I only do this when roots start to emerge on the surface. If done before, it can cause stem rot. The benefit of it is not having to disturb your alocasias to do a repot and leaving them in there as long as they can to mature and become resilient over time. I try to hold off on repots as long as possible. The indicator for me to repot is when the roots are at the top of the substrate and possibly coming out of the pot. And I'm going to get into two hybrid setups here. Hybrid meaning it's a combination of semi-hydro and another potting medium. This is my oldest alocasia. I've lost count on how many years I've had it, and it has been in this setup for more than 3 years, probably 4 years. As it grew out of the 100% leca setup and the roots started coming out the top, I created a moss collar. This was an experiment that turned into a permanent state, and now I use moss collars for a lot of my plants. The thinking behind this, and I'm going to show you one that's due for a moss collar. I'm going to avoid repotting and put a moss collar here instead. There's a lot of bare stem, and the thinking behind it is the moss collar is going to be an extension of that vessel. So it's going to encourage rooting higher up on the stem so that there's more roots heading into the substrate to support the plant. And here's another hybrid setup. The goal of these unique ways to pot your alocasias is to encourage as much root growth as possible. It's like having a root network that is so dense that you have a backup for a backup in case, there's some root fall off or some sort of inconsistency that happen. The more roots you can encourage your alocasias to have, the better off you're going to be. This was a tiny imported alocasia that I got that I was terrified to repot or do anything with when I got it. It was in a little 2-inch pot and it was also quite expensive and I just couldn't take the risk. So what I did was it came potted in soil and all I did was embed the pot when the roots started poking out the bottom. It was in a little mesh pot and I embedded it in lacquer and put it in a little dish of water and that's how it's been living so far. It's currently in that leaf cycling phase that my Alocasia sinuata that you're seeing now is currently coming out of. You can see here it's pushing its fourth leaf and coming out of that 3-leaf cycle. We'll get into the Alocasia behavior coming up soon. So this hybrid setup has been working for me in terms of getting this one to acclimate properly, and I know the leaf cycling will stop and more leaves will start to push out the more roots you get. So the goal should always be to encourage as much root growth as possible to be able to support the alocasia. Let's move on to pests, and this is simpler than you think. The recipe for my customized concoction is on my Instagram. If you saw my latest plant chores video, you would have gotten the 411 on this already. I'll be sure to link it in the description for you all to check out. In a nutshell, in a 500 ml water, I fill that 1/3 way up with rubbing alcohol and fill it the rest of the way with water and add 1 tablespoon of dish soap. Then I give it a good shake and I apply this to all my plants, not just alocasias, using a dish sponge to keep them clean. I apply this solution to the front and the back of the leaves, including the petiole. Don't get me wrong though, I know this is quite tedious and not for everyone. Usually, I have a pest prevention plan which involves spraying with neem oil weekly, but I can't spray in my bedroom and these plants are being stored here for now until the greenhouse gets up and going. But once that happens, it'll be back to my good old neem oil spraying and believe it or not, it really, really makes a difference to have that pest prevention plan. But in the event that my alocasias get some sort of infestation, usually it will be spider mites and it will be because I was not consistent in my pest prevention. I would go in with this same solution and remove as much pest as possible. And after that, I would spray with either Safer's Endol or Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew. Once your leaves are kept clean consistently, you're good to go. Let's get into alocasia propagation next, specifically growing from comb because that's my main method of propagation. For the ones who missed my alocasia tour, I'm just going to double back to some footage from that video to get you all in the know here about how to propagate from comb. Okay, so let's double back to my Alocasia heterophylla or my Alocasia dragon's breath and let's get into how to propagate these. I also recommend that you do give it a go to try and grow Alocasia from comb because once they grow in your care from comb, it means it's already acclimated to your space and it's going to be a dream or easy peasy basically to grow them in your space because they're already accustomed or they have been birthed there, so they are most comfortable there already, as opposed to buying a new one and having to acclimate it to your space, which is highly stressful for alocasias, and you tend to lose a ton of leaves and then you get stressed out. So let me take you through my comb growing process. So basically, this is what a comb looks like. It's attached to the mother plant by that tail, for lack of a better word. There we go. It's called a stolon. Basically, that's how the comb gets nutrition from the mother plant. These are a couple in my prop tray that have all grown from comb. Again, don't worry about the mildew that you're seeing there. It's absolutely harmless. And I left it in there and didn't clean up for you all to see the real deal and to see that it really is not something to be bothered about. But all of those are grown from comb, and these we are going to set. We're going to remove the stolon in each, as you'll see shortly, and set them on a bed of lacquer that you see there. And basically, once the comb starts to root, it will gain nutrition via the lacquer as I basically put nutrient water in there, but only when the lacquer starts to root. For now, it'll just sit in water, but as it starts to root, I add Super Thrive so that the comb can continue to get nutrition via that avenue because it's no longer attached to the mother plant and will need nutrition to grow. I just want to show you guys a comb that's covered in mildew. Here I'm squeezing it to show you that absolutely nothing is happening. It doesn't cause rot per se, and you'll see that I'm putting it back in because I'm absolutely unbothered, but it is good practice to keep your setup clean. In my experience anyway, it doesn't cause rot. What causes rot is when the combs sit in water in the humidity chamber for too long. So having demonstrated this for you guys, I will clean this setup up just as good health practice for myself, and you should do so as well because these particles can go airborne and cause health issues. So it is good practice to keep your setups clean. So anyway, back to the setup. Once you've sit your corms down onto a bed of lacquer, I place them into a humidity chamber to allow the corms to sprout. Once they push out that second leaf, I take them out of the chamber and I put them into their own dedicated vessel to continue rooting and growing in. Okay, so here's what we've covered so far: conditions and care, propagation, potting medium, and repotting. Actually, before I check off conditions and care, let me touch a bit on fertilizers. I think I've forgotten that. And don't forget, I'm giving away this free Alocasia Dragon's Breath, so stick around to find out how this can be yours. So, my current go to fertilizer right now is TPS1. I do not apply in full strength. I actually apply probably quarter of the dose just because I know my plants aren't growing optimally at this time because they're transitioning as well as they're not currently growing in ideal greenhouse conditions as they were originally. Even when my plants were growing optimally, I still applied half the dosage or a dilution as opposed to full strength because I find a little goes a long way with this TPS fertilizer. The instructions indicate that 2 to 4 teaspoons per gallon of water weekly is best, but I actually use 1 teaspoon per gallon of water, and I've cut down my feeds to bi-weekly or sometimes monthly because my plants are currently transitioning with the move, so they're not actively growing, but once they start back growing optimally, I will increase the dose to 2 teaspoons per gallon. I've never used 4 teaspoons per gallon. TPS1 has been a great fertilizer in general for all my plants. I love the convenience of just being able to use one fertilizer as well as being able to apply a fertilizer hydroponically and in soil. So that's a great thing about TPS1. A little goes a long way. I've noticed significant changes and improvement in health with just, using quarter of the dose, like I mentioned before. However, specifically for alocasias, I don't think this is the best fertilizer. Having used TPS1 for a year, I can safely say that I'm going to revert to using Neptune's fish and seaweed emulsion. I rather encourage more foliage growth than flowers, and this fertilizer to me was better for that. My reasoning is because once alocasias enter that floral phase, they're going to decline right after and lose a bunch of foliage. With that said, let's get into their behavior. Okay, in terms of behavior, the primary things to look out for is number one, dormancy, number two, leaf cycling. That's that three leaf cycle that happens so frequently. And three, I'm sure you're familiar with yellowing when they're unhappy. In the simplest way put, dormancy is natural to alocasias. Don't let it panic you. It's just a natural way that they respond, and a number of things can cause it. For me personally, it has been a change of environment. For example, I've moved homes or change in season from my friends who live in temperate countries. Once winter sets in, they start to see their alocasias go dormant. Secondly, after they flower. Thirdly, when they're combing. And fourthly, after repotting. Let me tell you what I do to try and curb the dormancy. Creating a stable environment fit, whether you live in a temperate country or tropics like me, once they have stable conditions that aren't fluctuating much, you're not going to see dormancy as frequently. Curbing flowering, for example, I'm going to switch my TPS1 fertilizer back to Neptune's to curb the flowering so that I can have more foliage than flowers appearing. Chopping off those flowers too can speed up the process. Here's one of my plants that is recovering from flowering. Two new leaves already on the way. I just left it be, and that's the best thing you can do. Do not think to repot your plant, just leave it alone. It will eventually reestablish itself. With respect to combing, I'll actually remove the combs from the pot, and that's a great thing about using clear vessels. However, if they're deep in the vessel, I would leave them be. I'm not going to disturb the roots to disrupt the existing growth just to retrieve the combs. But this one that you're seeing here on the surface, I can just pluck that out from the surface so that the plant can continue focusing energy on foliage rather than reproduction. Increasing your feeds can help here because you're giving the plant more energy to do both processes. And finally, repotting for me has caused dormancy in the past, and what I've done to limit this was to use supplements such as Calmag or Great White Myco that prevents trauma and just allows the plant to boost back from that disturbance a lot faster. Besides dormancy, another behavior common to alocasias is leaf cycling or getting stuck in that three leaf cycle. One's allocations are still adjusting in general, whether it's from an import, whether it's from a pest attack, or whether it's from repotting, it can just revert into that three-leaf cycle once the root system is not dense enough. Once you have a really strong, robust root system, you're not going to experience the three-leaf cycling anymore, just like my sinuata here that's now coming out of it because it has matured nicely and has attained a really dense root network to support multiple leaves. Once you switch focus to maintaining a dense root network as opposed to dense foliage, you're going to see all the changes that you want happening with your alocasia collection. Regular feeds and ensuring that it's getting enough nutrition also prevents the three-leaf cycling. Yellowing foliage or discolored foliage is the number one way alocasias communicate when they're unhappy. The best thing you can do during this time is to retrace your steps and figure out, well, what was the change that caused this to happen in the first place. Don't rush to repot your plants, especially if you have it in a clear vessels and the roots look fine. Leave it to recover. And that wraps up behavior. Let's move into some display tips. For a full lush display, just simply plant multiple plants in a pot. To keep the foliage upright, to get around using stakes. If you don't want to, try and place your allocations on the lowest level possible or on the floor so that the foliage will reach up towards the light. Let's debunk some popular myths next. Firstly, and you now know from me ranting about having dense roots in this video, repotting your alocasia when it's root bound is not necessarily. They do not abide by the same rules that we're accustomed to with phyllos and anthuriums. Just hold off on repotting as much as you can. I usually wait to see roots popping out of the top of the pot before I even think about repotting. The next point is that alocasias need high humidity. That's not so. They're fine in 40 to 60%, and I've tested this using my hygrometer, and I encourage you to do the same to prove me right. Another is that they can't be grown in no drainage. And while you've seen the majority of my collection being grown in no drainage, and you've seen the roots that they're pushing, so let's move on to the next. The presence of algae or algae buildup in your no drainage vessels negatively impacts growth. Take a look at my black velvet being grown in algae for almost 4 years and it's doing the best. Another myth is that soil is the best substrate to use for alocasias. My take on this is don't toss semi-hydro before you try it. Give it a go and decide for yourself. This one we discussed already, and it's that alocasias can't dry out. And you now know that they do need a bit of drying out to thrive. Another is that dual alocasias need low light to thrive, and I beg to differ. I believe they should receive a philodendron light, that concept that we discussed in the light category. Number 8 on this list is that alocasia leaves can't get wet. This one, I believe, came about because people started experiencing fungal issues, and that is not because the leaves were wet for a long period of time, it's because of a lack of airflow. Wiping your alocasia leaves and keeping them clean in general is the best pest prevention plan. And the last on this list is that you have to remove the protective coat on your corms to guarantee success. Remember, for all of these, actually, I have tested them myself, and that's why I've listed them as myths for me. Remember, this is all based on my experience and just my growing methodology, and just trying to figure out what really worked for my conditions. And pretty much, I didn't have to remove the protective coat. When I did do it, though, the corms all rotted. I had 0% success. So, what I do is I just pluck it off and place it on a bed of lacquer. This special consideration section is the best one for beginners especially. Let's make it short and sweet. Alocasia Jacqueline is the hardest alocasia for me to grow personally. The most pest-prone ones, and this is specific to spider mites and mealybugs, are my Alocasia Stingray, Zebrina, as well as my Alocasia Green Shield. Again, for me personally, and I just want to reiterate that everything you've seen in this video is all based on my personal experience, and I totally understand that it can be very wrong or very different for many people. But, at least I'm hoping that you can try and see for yourself if anything makes sense for you. But anyway, getting back to the special considerations, my Alocasia Frydek, which is the variegated Michelitziana, prefers Lushuzapon. I tried it in both soil and lacquer, and I had the most success growing it in Lushuzapon. Another special consideration is that if I had to choose one medium to pot my alocasias in, it will be lacquer because it's the cheapest, it's the most readily available, and brings the most amount of success, I would say, across the board or for the majority of my alocasias. with the exception of my Alocasia Frydek, my Maharani, and my Bisma. I'll tell you what my Maharani and Bisma prefer next. Honestly, I have no idea what determines the preference in terms of the substrate for alocasias, but from my experience, my Alocasia Bisma and my Alocasia Maharani prefers a soil substrate, particularly a Monstera mix. I have other videos that I'll link in the description below that explains, what my Monstera mix entails. And don't forget, a quick tip is to top these substrates with moss, especially the soil, so that you can get a visual cue before the alocasia tries to communicate with you by either drooping or, yellowing that you've underwatered. The moss will give you that cue up front. And to close this one out, I want to make a very clear disclaimer and, of course, explain how you can make that free dragon's breath yours. The disclaimer is to remember that everything I've presented is all subjective and is based on my personal experience, and it can go any which way when you start to undertake growing alocasias. The goal of this video is to simply present some data that can possibly help you figure out your alocasias better. The number one tip I can give you is to pay attention and observe your alocasias, as they're very visually communicative, so they will tell you what they want based on your growing method. And here's how to win the free Alocasia Dragon's Breath or Alocasia Heterophila. And that's to simply put a green heart in the comments and comment what's your most difficult alocasia, and let's discuss how to get it back up and running to its best and happiest state. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.